Okay, everyone, hello and welcome to our next snack seminar. It's one of the last ones for the year. We do have one next week, Mac, I think, right? I'm pretty sure.
Yep.
But one of the last ones for the year. And it's been a long time coming, this one from Roberto. Back in probably March, we started talking. Roberto was going to come to Sydney when we could actually still meet people in person and travel between different cities in Australia. And we talked about, spending a couple of days having a chat, and Roberto was going to give us a seminar as one of our earlier snack seminars. And then while he was here, he got sick. And, given if you turn up sick anywhere these days, you're going to be treated like a leper. So obviously that didn't go ahead back in April. And then the poop hit the fan even more. And so it's been a long time coming. But I'm really happy to welcome Roberto Muñoz. I hope that pronunciation was okay. Roberto is a PhD student at Monash with Kavan Pavli. Did I get his surname right?
Kavan Modi.
Modi, sorry, yeah. wrong surname. And is now Suchi your co-supervisor or just informally linked? So these are two very interesting people in information theory and complex systems in Australia, as some of you will hopefully know. So Roberto's working with both of them. He's technically at the Monash Quantum Information Science group, and his research interest lies at the intersection of tools from classical and quantum information theory. I don't understand quantum information theory at all, so if we touch on that, do go nice and slow. But today, I don't think we're dealing so much with that today. We're dealing more about using epsilon-machines to look at neural recordings in drosophila. So that'll be really interesting. We haven't touched on epsilon-machines in snacks yet, but a very interesting part of information theory and complex systems. What else can I say about Roberto? So he's been working with these tools to better understand the behaviour of complex physical systems, and he's been working with a variety of projects to that end, from analysing memory in the neural recordings of fruit flies across teams of both Australian and Japanese researchers to explain the unusual blinking patterns of quantum dots. Again, something I completely don't understand at all, but maybe the questions will lead us that way. Before doing his PhD, he's been looking at rare particle decays and building sensitive laser interferometers to answer fundamental questions about quantum mechanics. And you guys know I always like people who have a background like me, and I had a background in optics as well. So that's a second tick from me. So that's about all. As I say, this is an area, epsilon-machines, very interesting in information theory, but we haven't touched on it in snacks yet. It's a very, very complex and very deep area. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what it can tell us about the brains of Drosophila. So over to you, Roberto.
Great, thank you so much, Joe, and all the snack organizers for having me. So like Joe mentioned, this will be a talk where I go into epsilon-machines, and hopefully we can build a little bit of intuition for how they work and more or less what they represent. So I think I'd just like to coming out of the field, just share with you just the structure of the talk. So as the title suggests, this is some work that I've been doing on my PhD, and published with some collaborators from Monash and Queensland and Japan. So the frame of the talk, the way I'd like this to go ideally is I'll start with some motivations. So this will be like the background to the background, and hopefully this will be able to frame the goals that we had for this work. And once that's done, I'll actually dive into the actual background, go into a bit of detail, but I want to approach it a lot more conceptually rather than mathematically. And I think the aim for this is to be that maybe along the way, there might be enough details for you to see that, hey, like a lot of these methods could be used for your own analyses or your own data sets. So that would be really cool. So then I'll go into the results and then talk about, the discussions and directions for future work. And as Joe's mentioned, please feel free to ask any questions along the way as well. So this is the paper that we published in Physical Review Research around last year. And it really came about by learning about the ways different theories of consciousness describe the flow of information throughout the brain. Now, from a physical or mathematical standpoint, What we mean by information flow, or one of the ways to kind of talk about it, would be the following. Now, of course, it wouldn't be a good physics talk if I didn't approximate something as a sphere. So this is my spherical neuron. We can give it a name, we can give it a friend, and we can allow them to share some information between one another. So if we want to depict how they share information over some interval in time, we actually might be able to draw up a diagram like this. So here we see that the first neuron is transferring or sending information back to itself in the next time step, same with the second neuron, neuron B, and they're also allowed to direct information to one another over this time. So this is one interval of time, but we can just extend this picture back if we want to describe how this 2-neuron brain is going to behave over time, and you end up with this structure here. Now, I guess obviously most brains are a lot more complex than just having 2 neurons. So we can generalize this thing, right? We can just group all the neurons in a single time step, and no matter how many there are, and basically just take snapshots of the entire brain over time intervals. And so when we do that, we might end up with a picture like this. So this is the brain at the present step, and in the last interval, there's some information feeding forward towards it. And then you extend the picture back, and then you have kind of this chain of information flow, which looks like this. Now, the key thing to note here is that no matter how interlinked the neurons are, no matter how complicated the direction or how complicated they're swapping information between one another, the essential thing to highlight here is that all the information flow and all the correlations only depend on the last time step. And so when we have systems that behave like this, I'm sure some of you know, this is known as a Markovian description for some dynamics, where the future behavior of your system depends on the present. And so it's kind of just one last time step in the past. So in some conversations with the co-authors, we were kind of learning about that there are these certain measures or certain quantities out there in the theory of, in the field of neuroscience. And these try to actually describe or quantify how much consciousness, someone or something might be experiencing. And so the way, while the translation of these, of having a conscious experience to mathematics is very much outside the scope of this talk, one thing that became apparent to us when we began looking at this is that a lot of these quantities and theories rely on these Markovian assumptions. So it's a very simple picture, but it's not one that is likely to be borne out in reality. So in reality, it's likely to expect that we might see information from multiple times in the past having a bearing on the brain's future behavior. So for example, in this picture, information from 2 time steps in the past might be important and relevant. And so in this case, the brain would actually have to remember more than just its last state. And so in this picture, this is an example of non-Markovian behavior or something with memory. So we could go even further. We could say, okay, maybe the last 3 time steps have a bearing on the future behavior of the brain. And so you have to account for all of that to describe the evolution, and so on and so forth, until you get to kind of a picture like this, where, to figure out if a brain actually has or uses information from multiple time steps in the past to dictate future behavior. And so the key point is that if you have a system that behaves like this, it has to keep track of this information somewhere, right? It has to store this memory. And so any system that is going to exhibit some non-Markovianity has to carry some amount of internal memory. That could be a lot of memory, could be a little bit, but the key thing is that it's not going to be 0. So right away, we can kind of spring these 2 questions. You can spring number 1 is there a way to extract or see how much memory is being stored in these brain recordings? And secondly, does an increasing amount of memory actually correlate to increasing awareness or state of conscious arousal, right? So for the second one, if we think back to these theories or measures of consciousness which try to quantify this, there's clearly some scope to try and generalize these to notions of multi-time or non-Markovian behavior. And it would be nice to see whether including non-Markovianity has any bearing on the effects of maybe distinguishing between behavioral states of consciousness. So if we include it, does this actually help us with anything like that at all? So kind of with that big umbrella theme of looking for memory in brain recordings, the question is, how do we go about extracting the amount of memory contained within some data? So for the case of our neural recordings, we've already kind of seen how little is too little, right? And that might be the Markovian picture, where if you have a description like this, it might not really be enough to truly model accurately the way the brain behaves. But what about like the converse question, right? So how much information is too much information? So for example, in this picture, like we have what Markov order, well, the last 9,000 time steps, are in this picture, but, we might not need that much, right? The brain might not utilize all of that. And so we have this kind of notion that if we kind of overcompensate, it's not very useful computationally or qualitatively if we want to try and describe our brain dynamics like this. So we need some kind of like middle ground, like we have to not overestimate or add superfluous information if we don't have to. So there's a way to actually extract the minimal amount of memory contained within some data. And the good news is, I think a lot of people actually have already a very good intuition of the underlying concepts behind how to actually do this. And so hopefully I can prove this to you in the next couple of slides. So we're going to start with just a very basic example of flipping a coin, right? Where we have outcomes of heads or tails and it's fair. So we have 50-50 chance of getting one of these outcomes. So in this kind of regular coin flip process, what we're going to do is we're going to flip the coin a bunch of times. Doesn't matter how many, but let's just say, like 1 million for argument's sake. And we write down all the outcomes. And so then I ask you, having all this stuff, or if someone were to ask you, what is going to be the next outcome? What would you say it's going to be? Maybe I'll open this to the audience. Like, what will the next flip be if I ask?
Tails.
Tails. Why would you say it's tails?
I like tails.
You like tails? Okay, fair enough. Do you know with certainty that it would be tails?
No.
Okay, right. So there's kind of like this knowledge, right? So we know that we can't really say for certain what the next flip will be. We can guess, we can speculate based off, what we like, if we like tails. But at the end of the day, we have this intuitive sense that, well, it might make more sense to talk about things that are likely to happen in a probabilistic sense rather than deterministic. So we really have this 50-50 chance of heads or tails. Okay, so we have this kind of intuition that we have to describe things in terms of probabilities, and mathematically, or I guess formally, the notion is like we talk about these systems or these recordings or this data as a stochastic process. So that's what we're doing. So if I ask you, okay, let's say the last flip was heads, what is going to be the next flip now? And I think most of us would say, well, the answer is still going to be heads or tails with a 50-50 chance, right? And this is like a little bit interesting, right? So the last outcome doesn't really have an effect on the future behavior, okay? It's kind of curious. Okay, what about if the last flip was tails? And I asked the same question, what's the probability of, well, what's the next flip? Again, the behavior is going to be the same, 50-50 either way. And if I ask if the last 3 flips were heads, we get the same picture. So look, what I'm doing right now might seem very obvious and elementary, but it's building a point, right? It's showing that if we understand memory as being related to how past behavior influences the future, this is something that's very easy and intuitive for us to grasp. And I hope, with this coin toss example, this is quite obvious. And if we kind of keep extending this out, right, we see, okay, what if the last 1 million flips were the sequence that we got? Hopefully you see that really none of the past information actually has any bearing on the future at all, on the future behavior of the coin. The future behavior is always going to be 50-50 no matter what. And so knowing this, if you had to guess or speculate how much memory the process of tossing a coin would have, what would you guess? What would be something reasonable to assume here? Anyone want to give it a shot?
Joe's unmuted.
Or you'd have to guess.
say no memory, right?
No memory, right? Exactly. You know, so the past, you know, if we want to think of how much memory does this process store to predict the future, it's none. None of the past matters. So intuitively, we kind of have this idea that, and an understanding that, you know, the memory for these kind of processes is going to be zero. We don't need any of that past information. So just to kind of recap the main things, we know, number one, it's more useful to talk about things from a statistical point of view. And number two, we know that when the past is totally irrelevant to the future, we know that this is going to be some memoryless thing. So let's kind of like make things a little bit more complicated, right? Let's say I have a coin and it's a little bit special now in the sense that it's just going to flip between outcomes. If I flip heads, the next outcome is going to be tails. And if I flip again, it'll be heads, and it just kind of alternates that. So we can repeat the same steps, right? If the last flip was a heads, what's the next flip going to be? Well, it's determined by this behavior. The probability of tails is going to be 1. It's definitely going to get tails in the next flip. And also, you know, it's an impossibility to get heads. What if the last flip was tails? Well, we have something a little bit different. The probability of seeing heads is now 1, and the probability of seeing tails is 0. And if you want to kind of guess like, okay, what's the main point here, is that like, no, these are different future behaviors. Depending on whether we saw last a tails or whether we last saw a heads, it actually gives us 2 different future behaviors, right? So clearly we can kind of understand this point that, you know, some past sequences don't always lead in the same kind of future behavior. There is some kind of distinction for some processes. So not all past behaviors like considered equal. And maybe we might also guess, just kind of speculating, what do you think the memory, or what do you think we need to kind of fully describe the future behaviors? If I flipped 1,000,000 times, will I need all the 1,000,000 flips? Probably not, right? So we can kind of understand that there is such this thing as too much memory, right? In this case, we only really need the last flip, and anything before is something we don't need to store. So we can actually be, you know, more efficient. We can actually find some kind of nice minimal amount of stuff that we need to predict the future. So in this case, there's going to be 2 groups of past sequences. We're going to have heads, which we see with tail certainty, and vice versa. So there's kind of these 2 groups of sequences, or 2 groups of future behaviors. Okay. So let's say, just to make this a bit more complicated once more, and just to really ground the intuition, let's say I have a magic coin. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast some enchantments on this. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to say, if I have 3 heads in a row, if I flip 3 heads, then the next 10 flips with certainty are going to be tails. And outside of that, the coin will just behave as normal, right? So it'll be kind of like this magic coin. So if you were kind of to now ask the question, okay, what do you need about the past to capture the future behavior? So in other words, like the alternating coin, we saw there were 2 groups of past sequences that led to 2 sets of different future behaviors. How many of those groups do you think would be in this example, if you had to guess? It's a little bit more complicated. It's a bit trickier, but you will have more than 2, right? So, you know, hopefully you'll see that first of all, the coin has to remember sequences of 3 flips until it sees 3 heads. And then on top of that, it has to kind of remember how many tails it counts after that. So it has to have some kind of memory, right? And that's the intuitive point here with this example that I'm trying to build. It's that obviously this process is going to have a lot of memory. And so building on what we understood from the first 2 examples, we can understand that there's going to be quite a few past sequences that will lead to very different future behaviors for this enchanted coin. So, but not always, right? Ultimately, there might be some past sequences which also lead in the same future behavior. So clearly there's a bit of a balance, and the goal is to find the smallest possible number of these past sequence groups that lead to the future behavior. So let's just quickly summarize what we already knew. The intuition, first of all, we know that we're going to model our data as a stochastic process, and this is the same for the brain data in our study. Secondly, is we need to find all the groupings of past sequences that lead to different future behaviors. The third is that the entire past is not always needed. There's going to be a point where that's kind of like enough, which is like the intrinsic memory of the system, and anything further we can kind of throw away. And so based off kind of these 3 points, the fourth is that we need to find the smallest number of these past groupings. And that will give us the memory of our process. So is there a way to do this? There definitely is. This is an algorithm called the causal state splitting reconstruction, or scissor algorithm. And it does exactly this procedure for us. You send in some time series data. So this could be anything you want, from a coin flip to brain recordings. You send it through the algorithm and it will actually spit out that memory, the amount of memory and the memory structure, which we'll get to in a little bit. So the way it kind of does that is the following. I'll kind of go through just the mechanics of it really quick. So the first thing that you do is you start out by, let's do this with the coin toss example, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with some maximum past sequence length that we want the algorithm to look for. So obviously we don't have infinite data, so we can't go to infinity. We have to kind of stop it at some point. There is a cap on like how far back you can look given some data, which is limited by, you know, the length of data and a couple of other properties. So in essence, you can't go too far back without running into some statistical problems, but there's nice kind of ways to set that length. So we're going to call this length like L max, right? So the way the algorithm starts, it starts with a single grouping, and the principle that's going to guide it is going to say, let's only make more groupings if we need to. If we don't have to, we won't do a thing. Okay, so with the coin flip, what's going to happen? We start with sequence lengths of 0, and we're going to start evaluating the future behavior of the data given past sequences of length 0. So in other words, we're going to do this, right? What's the probability of heads or tails given that I see a past sequence of nothing? So this is just the same as just seeing the probability of heads or tails in the data. And so you're going to record 50-50. If it's an unfair coin, you might record something else, but that's basically what you're going to do. And that's the first step, right? That's the first step done. So now we move to, this algorithm moves to sequence lengths of 1. And a few things have changed here. Notice that this grouping now contains all observations of length 0, which might seem a little bit trivial, but right, it's important to say that this is going to capture all those observation lengths. So we move to a sequence length of 1 and we do the same procedure, right? Evaluate the future behavior based off past sequences of length 1, right? So what's that going to mean is that the algorithm is going to say, if I see a heads, what's the probability of seeing heads or tails? And if I see tails, what's the probability of seeing the future, right? And so, for example, in this case, it's going to compare those conditional probabilities with the probabilities or the future behavior given anything in the current states we've so far reconstructed. It's a bit of a mouthful, but this is kind of what it looks like, right? So we start with heads of one kind of, we last saw heads. We evaluate these conditional probabilities. And so we know that in our fair coin, the last outcome doesn't matter. So we'll still see 50-50. And notice that those probabilities are the same as the probability of seeing nothing at all, right? So in that case, we add the sequence of 1 heads into the group now and keep it in that kind of grouping. And the same thing for tails. If we last saw tails, we still know that the future probability is still 50-50. So that's the same as seeing nothing at all. So we put that also in the group. And so then, you know, we can just consider the next step, right? The algorithm considers.
Sorry, can I interrupt just to make sure that I'm understanding? So sure. The things in the oval are these are sort of causally equivalent observations, right? Thinking about what Crutchfield has said. So it doesn't matter whether I see heads or tails. My beliefs about the future are the same. Is that kind of the gist of it?
That is spot on the gist of it. Exactly right. Yeah. So exactly. So we have in the literature, they call them causally equivalent pasts. And they say, you know, if these two pasts are causally equivalent, then they belong in the same kind of grouping. So exactly right. So you can kind of consider, you know, every kind of this grouping is like a container. It's a box that has a bunch of past sequences, which all will lead to the same future behavior. Yeah. Okay, so right, for length of 2, we kind of do the same thing. We can just do this a little bit quicker, right? So we look at the future probability for seeing 2 heads. We find out it's the same as seeing just heads or tails. So we add it in. Same for tails, heads, and heads, tails, and so on and so forth. And so all of these belong in the same grouping, right? And hopefully you'll be able to see that, you know, in the fair coin and the memoryless coin, this will just keep on happening until you hit that maximum memory length that you put in at the start. And so you see that, you know, if you kind of continue this process, you're only going to end up with one grouping. And you know that no matter what you see in that grouping, because it contains every possible past sequence, you know that the future behavior is going to be 50-50 of seeing heads or tails. So by the way, when we have these kind of groupings and we add these arrows, these transitions between them, and we label them with probabilities, this whole structure, this is known as the epsilon machine, this collection of groupings and transitions and probabilities. So this is the epsilon machine for a memoryless process. It's just one state. Okay, so just going back to something more tricky, what about our enchanted coin? Well, we find that, you know, if we get to L equals 3, so sequence lengths of 3, we can see that triple heads is going to be significantly different from seeing just heads, heads, or heads, tails, right? This is the enchantment condition, right? We see triple heads and then we get a bunch of tails. And so because of that, it has to go into its own grouping. And it turns out that triple tails is the same, right? It could be part of that long post-enchantment chain, or it could just be part of regular coin behavior. But in any sense, it's quite different. So it also goes in its same grouping as well. And in reality, this will actually happen a lot sooner. You only actually need to see one flip of tails for this to occur. But anyway, that's kind of just a side point. And so you might think, okay, well, the rest, there's nothing special about them, so that they'll go in the same grouping. But it turns out that this, you know, special enchantment actually messes up things quite a bit. And so you end up with, you know, a grouping like so. And so when all is said and done, right, if we would continue this process with the enchanted coin, if we look far back enough, the algorithm will actually converge on a structure. And we will be able to see that the whole memory structure of the enchanted coin will be contained in this, if we consider sequence lengths that are sufficiently long enough. And so this is it. This is basically the smallest model that needs to predict the future behavior of your enchanted coin and accounts for all its memory. So this picture here is the epsilon machine for our enchanted coin example. So let's take a quick stock of what happened here, right? We started with a memoryless assumption and we only added structure as necessary. So this is a very Occam's razor-like approach. So in a way, by doing this, you minimize like the amount of superfluous information or structure you don't really need, and what you're left with is the minimal, like, little nugget of memory that is actually intrinsic to that process. Now, I said that memory is related to the number of these groupings. In this case, is like 13 of them. So the memory is actually the entropy over these groups, right? If I call the ith grouping a name, I can find out what the probability of being in any one of these is at any time in our data. And then the entropy over that probability distribution turns out to be the memory. So for example, in our coin toss, we only had one grouping. So the probability of being in that grouping is 1. And so the entropy over a distribution of 1 is 0, right? And that works out, right? The memory of that process is 0. So that's the whole procedure. This is exactly how we extract memory from some time series data. Does anyone have any questions at this point about this thing, or are we kind of okay? All good? All right. See, I knew we all had intuition for this kind of stuff, right? Okay, so bring it back to kind of the neuroscience, right? So this is the exact procedure that we performed. So this is the data that we had measured by our co-authors. So we have a fruit fly brain that was measured with a probe, electrical probe, that had some channels over it, so we could resolve spatial locations in the brain. And we measured fly brain signals over 2 conditions: wakeful and anaesthetised, which was mediated by isoflurane. And so all in all, we had around 13 flies. We had 15 different spatial locations, from like the peripheral to the central hemisphere regions. And for each of those spatial locations, what that would output is we'd measure this local field potential, which we then binarized into just a kind of like a bit string. And from that bit string, that's what we fed into this scissor algorithm to infer this complexity in this structure. So we performed kind of this inference of memory for all the data, all the flyers, all the channels, everything. And so to the big question, you know, does this work? Do we actually see a difference in memory structure between wakeful and anaesthetized? Well, here's a little interactive like quiz, right? So this is some epsilon machines from the same fly over the same channel, inferred at like a sequence length of 3. Now, can anyone guess which one is from the wakeful side and which one is from the anaesthetized side?
Is that a trick question?
Just try it out.
Well, I would think right was awake.
Yep.
But maybe it's a trick question.
Yeah, no, it's nailed it. Exactly right. Yeah. So exactly. So we found that in, you know, this example, right? So the wakeful epsilon machine turns out to be a lot more complex, and it has a lot more memory contained within the data series.
So,
and yeah, sorry.
So, I mean, coming from the more neurobiology side of things, anesthesia, you know, universally decreases the activity of all of the neurons, right? Like, is this just a trivial result that you just have fewer spikes when the organism is anesthetized?
So I would say that it's not, recall we're measuring LFP potential, not spikes, for starters as well, but not necessarily, right? Like, this is a little bit different to just like, you know, the decrease of, you know, like a signal or the dampening of a signal. I mean, ultimately it is looking at the memory structure within that signal, irrespective of how like dampened, I guess it is. So it really is like a statement of how much memory or how much informational structure in terms of memory is lost under anesthesia. So I would say, yeah, it's quite different to that. Yeah. So anyway, on
that, sorry,
yeah.
Just on that, you know, I guess one thing you could check was, you know, what was the simple entropy of that binarized signal itself, and see how different that was. But it looks like, you know, yeah, because your transitions on the left-hand side are all around 50-50, it looks like there is a fair bit of activity. It's not like in that binarized signal there's simply not much happening. It looks like there's still a lot happening there, and it simply is, as you say, the structure of what's happening that is the big difference.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you can see it, at least for this example, there's still some non-zero memory. So it's not completely trivial, even when it's under anesthesia. It's not just a memoryless process of like noise or something like that. So there is something happening still there. Yeah.
Thomas, was that okay? Do you want to follow anything up on that?
No, it's just, you know, when I've done a number of anesthesia studies, and this is sort of a perennial issue, you know, trying to untangle what is a, you know, a non-trivial change in information structure versus what is just kind of an obvious effect of the anesthetic. But, you know, it also may be a moot point, right? If there's less activity, then there's less information. So that may just be it. But,
in your experience, like, so coming to that question of like distinguishing between like trivial like information loss versus non-trivial, like what's the general way that people go in terms of answering that question? Like, what's trivial from not?
I don't think the field has agreed on something yet. I know there's been some interest in resampling data, trying to like force a maximum entropy distribution on everything, and trying to see then, you know, how do the relationships fall out. But you know, this is just the kind of thing that like every paper I've done on anesthesia, you get some reviewer who is just saying, oh, this is all silliness because it's, you know, everything shuts up, so of course there's nothing interesting happening.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's just having good baselines. So if you can show the performance of you know, the mean of the signal versus its linear autocorrelation versus and you can rule out all those give bad performance, but it's only when you go to statistical complexity you can discriminate them. That would be the measure to go, well, this is doing something that the others aren't. But if you only use this, you go, well, this is doing something, but you can't say if it's beating simpler baselines.
Yeah, that would be a good point. Like to actually, you know, compare, you know, this complexity measure with a whole bunch of other things that let you rule out that thing. Yeah.
CTSA.
Exactly right.
Just to add one other kind of thought here, right, is that the median in the two cases is going to be quite different in terms of the firing rate that it's relating to, or the LFP intensity or what have you. So it might be that if you did a median split across the entire set, right, of all anesthetic and wakeful data, and the median was defined on that rather than, or maybe, I don't know, did you just look at defining the median on each data set separately or the entire time series to see if that changed the result?
Yeah, for some reason I have a vague memory of us messing around with the way the median split was taken. I recall we also tried other like thresholding methods that weren't necessarily the median, and we did like a little prelim analysis with that, and I think we found that it was relatively like the results were quite the same. So I think for the study we just were like, well, let's just go ahead with the median because it gives kind of the same results. Any other questions or like comments?
Just a follow-up, you know, I think kind of getting at what you started discussing with Thomas, you know, something you could do, and I don't think it's going to lead to a problem, so this is not meant to suggest that it's something you really need to check, but I think something you could construct here as a null model for the anesthesia would be to take that series of your ones and zeros and then shuffle them up. You know, if the null hypothesis is that there's simply not much activity under anesthesia, well, we say, okay, well, let's take the same level of activity. So if it was really not much activity and there was only, you know, a 1, the probability of a 1 was, you know, 1% or something. Okay, let's have a series with the same probability, but no memory, because we've shuffled everything up, and have a look at what the statistical complexity comes out. And then we've got that forms a baseline to compare to say, okay, well, yeah, if we had something with the same level of activity, here's what the statistical complexity would look like if there were no memory, and we're obviously better than that.
Yeah. And
I think it's very clear you are going to be different to that. I think here. I don't foresee any problems there.
Just another comment, actually. So if we mean, like, if you want to talk about like activity as in like the, you know, the amount of spiking signals that you get, right? There has actually I think been 2 other studies which use epsilon-machines, and they look at spiking neurons. So they look at spike trains, and I don't think they really do it in terms of whether you can distinguish between different levels of consciousness, but they do find some interesting things. They do find like this kind of, there is some structure in them, and at least for wakeful, and that there is like this universality in structure depending on your time temporal resolution, which is quite interesting in itself. But yeah, like definitely, like, you know, doing like these baseline things would help, but I would also probably expect that there is still some structure there that's not just trivial.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, I think it all comes back to, as Tom said, in you know, studying the effects of anesthesia, that seems to be a question that people are asking a lot. So if that came up, that could be a way to tackle it.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot, you know, by or imply that none of this is valid. It's just, you know, it's something that comes up perennially for me.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. Like, I mean, yeah, if it comes up a lot, then yeah, makes sense to ask how you avoided, or how you tackled it, right? So there you go. Okay, so I guess I can go on.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, this is just a single sample, single result. So for an entire sample, this is kind of what we look like. So what this plot is basically doing, it says, let's look at the difference in complexity, the average difference in complexity between wake and anaesthetised, and then we're just going to compute like the t-score of that average relative to the sample, and kind of find which differences are the most significant. So on the vertical axis here, this is basically the longest sequence length that we let the algorithm look for. in terms of time steps. And so this data is 1 kilohertz. So each of these time step is a millisecond. And in the x-axis, you have the spatial location of the brain from central to peripheral. So the redder the plot we actually get, it means the greater the difference in memory between awake and anaesthetized. And if it's red, it means it was higher in the wakeful condition rather than anaesthetized. These dotted regions just indicate the areas where that difference was significant. So on average, we find that wakeful memory is a lot higher compared to anesthesia. And so this effect also appears to increase the longer we allow, or the more memory we account for in the algorithm. So the longer we allow to look back, we see a much more stark difference. Note that like for small memory lengths, so for example, for like memory lengths of 2, we don't actually see that much differentiation between these two states of conscious arousal. And I guess this can kind of be interpreted that the difference between them is actually hidden or encoded in these higher order correlations. So you really do have like quite a significant structure there. We also find that the response to complexity isn't constant throughout locations of the brain. So different brain regions had a different response to reduction in memory induced by anesthesia. And so from this chart, you can kind of see that in like the mid-hemisphere region, you have this area which is most sensitive, in contrast to the peripheral region, where we don't really see much difference in memory reduction at all under anesthesia, even if we probe at high Markov orders. So that might indicate, something nice about the way that, different brain regions respond or kind of process information there. But, this all being said, I'd like to point out that like, each y-axis grid is 1 millisecond long. And so we're still seeing a very good macroscopic kind of distinction between these states of all these behaviors of consciousness at very micro time scales with this method. So that's quite fun.
Just throwing a couple of questions on this slide, Roberto. The measure of significance here, is this that you've compared the population of trials or subjects awake and trials or subjects anaesthetized, and there's a difference between those two groups? Is that where that comes from? Yeah. So this is like the paired two-tailed like t-test. So you look at the average between the two conditions and then just find out like, okay, which of these is like a significant difference away from the sample that you have. Good. And then stopping at past history of 11, I take it that's a computational limitation, that it's just too hard to go beyond that.
No, but it was a limitation based off how well this performs given limited data. So for example, if your data is like, let's say 10 time steps long, it would be a little bit unreasonable to choose sequence lengths over 9, because you have a window that you can sample from here, and then that's basically it, right? So
sure. So how long was the data? It's very finely sampled. So how long was it?
So there were 18,000 data points, I believe. So 18,000 time steps, and so that puts, I think the relation is I mean, I can't do the maths in my head, but it was like 11 that we kind of capped it at.
Yeah.
There is obviously as well, rightfully so, like I should point out that like the algorithm does scale exponentially. The runtime scales exponentially with the longer memory lengths. So there is a point that, even if you could go up to 30, that might take you a very long time. But we thankfully didn't run into that issue with this data. Or not thankfully, depending on how you want to look at it, right?
Yeah. So along similar lines, there's more a curiosity than suggesting that you should have done it this way. I'm wondering whether, if you've got 18,000 samples, that's about 18 seconds or so worth from your sampling rate. So you presumably actually had more, but you sort of had to cut it off there for, again, computational time, I suppose. What about,
you mean the downsampling rate?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I wonder about downsampling, but taking longer than 18 seconds. to see if you could go basically further into the history, but at a less fine grain.
Yeah. So this was recorded, I think, at 20,000 20,000 hertz, and it was downsampled when we received the data to 1. And I think we questioned this a little bit, and I don't really have the expertise to comment on this, but I believe the conversation was around that, like, you know, most of the interesting things are going to happen at this 1 kilohertz thing. If you end up with 20,000 hertz, is a bit too fine to really.
Oh yeah, no, I was thinking about going the other way, like downsampling even further.
Oh yeah, exactly. You totally could, right? Yeah. Okay. So you mean increase the overall experimental interval?
Just simply because, you know, as you say, you're seeing this dependence out to 11 time steps at the moment, and it makes you wonder, okay, is there more still? And if you want to get at more still, you probably got to downsample so that you can computationally handle it.
Yeah, so that's a point we do address in the paper, which is effectively that it's unlikely here that we are saturating that Markov order, which means there's still likely more memory to uncover if we would go further out, right? And so by doing that, you could totally explore that by changing that temporal resolution, which we didn't do in this paper, but it's something you could totally do. Yeah, cool. That's a good point. Great. So yeah, basically, so this is the results for the complexity side of things, the memory side of things. We see that, you know, that this memory is reduced under general anesthesia. Just the last little part of the study. So far we've been talking about memory in the forward time direction. But the really nice thing about having these epsilon machines and these memory kind of quantities is that they're quite flexible in the information and information theoretic and information geometric space. So you can transform them and play around with them and still have some quite nice interpretable quantities, right? So, for example, one thing that we did is you could actually infer the structure in the forward direction, but you can also run the data in verse and infer the same, infer the memory structure in the reverse direction. And if you look at the memory difference between them, you have this quantity called causal reversibility, which is kind of like a little bit of a weird thing to wrap your head around, but basically it can allow us to actually figure out if there's some kind of temporal asymmetry between the wakeful and anaesthetized conditions. So does wakeful brain recordings have some asymmetry that's greater than anaesthetized or not? So it lets you explore that, right? So for this quantity, we did the same thing, and we find that we looked at the difference of that asymmetry in wakeful and anaesthetized, and we find that we actually don't see too much, which is quite interesting. So we find that in terms of the memory point of view, general anesthesia doesn't really change how reversible the brain is in terms of how much memory it stores in either direction. So that was quite interesting. But we can do more, right? There's other notions of time reversibility that we can talk about. So in this instance, we can also talk about if we have the forward model and we use it to predict the probability of seeing a sequence, and the reverse model, if I use one of these to explain the data of the other, how surprised will I be? And for this, we use the KL divergence, and this thing's asymmetric, so we could just symmetrize it by just adding the second term there. And we can kind of see this asymmetry as well. And this is what we find. We find that in the wakeful state, there is an asymmetry that is offered by this memory structure, which you don't actually see under anesthesia. And once more as well, we have this other quantity known as crypticity. Basically, the way to interpret it is saying, like, if I give you the forward model, how much extra information do you need to be able to synchronize it to the reverse model? And this is also kind of this notion of how similar is the structure between forward reverse from awake and anesthetized. So once we looked at that, we found that we see this significant difference as well again. So if we go by the premise that wakeful brains should be better at predicting the next sensory input, then it makes sense to expect that general anesthesia should mess with these informational structures depending on time direction. And indeed, like from these results, we see that that's definitely the case. So taken together, like these time asymmetry results show that that there is some asymmetry which is lost under general anesthesia in terms of the structure, but not so much the actual memory content. And just like the complexity results, this also seems to vary depending on the brain location in the brain as well, which is quite interesting. Okay, so just to wrap up, that's basically the study in the nutshell. So going back to the initial focus, right, of theories of consciousness, the results that we have, they're not saying that memory equals consciousness. I mean, so after all, like the circuits in my phone have a high degree of memory, but I don't think many people would say that my phone is conscious, I hope, right? So clearly marrying non-Markovianity, so memory studies, with a theories of consciousness, yeah, it's a bit of a delicate work, and it's a lot of work too. But I think, in my opinion, a successful theory should be able to actually explain these non-Markovian and time asymmetric effects as well. Outside of theories of consciousness, there's still quite a lot to be explored in terms of the information theoretic and information geometric landscape that we have available. Finding interpretations for like all these quantities, you know, complexity, reversibility, and relating them to like phenomenological behaviors, it's still a very open question that can be explored. And it's also likely that these kind of questions can be better answered by applying these methods to new data sets. So, you know, human EEG, different organisms, longer data sets, or even data sets recorded over multiple kind of different levels of conscious arousal rather than awake. And anaesthetised, you could include sleeping or something else, right? And yeah, the good news is that all these methods presented here, they're extremely versatile. So basically they can be applied on almost anything that can be recorded over time. And the algorithm, the scissor algorithm, is also open source, so anyone can just go and download it and begin playing with it straight away. So yeah, there's quite a lot of opportunity for future work, but I hope that in this talk, you know, I may have explained the concepts well, and that you might have seen, yeah, maybe some of this might be interesting for your own studies and things like that. So that's the talk. Just before I wrap up, I'd just like to thank the co-authors that really made this study possible, especially my supervisors, Kevin Modi, Felix Pollock, and now Suchiya from Monash. I'd like to thank Joe and the snack organizers for having me here. And finally, a little shameless plug is that I finished my PhD in April, and so I'm looking for postdoc or industry positions. So if you have any interest in kind of making some of the skill sets here work with your own projects, then I'd love to have a chat. Please reach out for me, or you can scan the QR code and that will take you to the CV. Yeah, anyway, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Roberto. If you're watching online, I do encourage you to scan that QR code.